Song of Fools. For as the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fool. This also is vanity. Surely oppression maketh a wise man mad, and a gift destroyeth the heart. Better is the end of a thing than the beginning thereof, and the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. Be not hasty in thy spirit, angry, for anger resteth in the bosom of fools. Say not thou, what is the cause that the former days were better than these? For thou doest not inquire why concerning this. Wisdom is good with an inheritance, and by it there is profit to them that see the sun. For wisdom is a defense, and money is a defense. But the excellency of knowledge is that wisdom giveth to them that giveth life to them that have it. Consider the work of God, for who can make that straight which he hath made crooked? In the day of prosperity be joyful, but in the day of adversity consider. God hath also set the one over against the other, to the end that men should find nothing after him. All things have I seen in the days of my vanity. There is a just man that perisheth in his righteousness, and there is a wicked man that prolongeth his life in his wickedness. Be not righteous overmuch, neither make thyself overwise. Why shouldest thou destroy thyself? Be not overmuch wicked, neither be thou foolish. Why shouldest thou die before thy time? It is good that thou shouldest take hold of this, yea, also from this withdraw not thine hand, for he that feareth God shall come forth of them all. Wisdom strengtheneth the wise more than 10 mighty men which are in the city. For there is not a just man upon earth that doeth good and sinneth not. Also take no heed unto all the words that are spoken, lest thou hear the servant curse thee. For oftentimes also thine own heart knoweth that thou likewise hast cursed others. All this have I proved by wisdom. I said, I will be wise, but it was far from me. That which is far off and exceeding deep, who can find out? I applied mine heart to know and to search and to seek out wisdom and the reason of things, and to know the wickedness of folly, even of foolishness and wickedness. And I find more bitter than death the woman, whose heart is snares and nets, and her hands as bands, who pleaseth God shall escape from her, but the sinner shall be taken by her. Behold, this have I found, saith the preacher, counting one by one, to find out the account, which yet my soul seeketh. But I find not. One man among 1,000 have I found, but a woman among all those have I not found. Lo, this only have I found, that God hath made man upright, but they have sought out many inventions. Okay, so here we have Solomon kind of bringing to the forefront wisdom in a manner that might not be typically thought. Maybe is the best way to say that. So in the first several verses here, Solomon presents what are difficult and yet what I kind of refer to as tried and true wisdom. And so in the first 6 verses here, Solomon is going to contrast what a lot of people think as good with what many would proclaim as bad. And yet what he's going to do is he's going to say there is wisdom to be found in the bad, quote unquote, where there isn't to be found in the good. And so he contrasts death, sorrow, and mourning, and he says that these things are to be seen as better, quote unquote, than birth, feasting, and laughter. And so it's this interesting thing that Solomon is doing here, and you read it, at first it almost seems macabre. It seems, he seems to be kind of glorifying death and that which is what most people would say are the most negative times in a person's life. However, what Solomon is doing is pointing out the wisdom that accompanies those kinds of events. And by that, what I mean, it is in life's happiest times that we can get lost in the merriment of the moment. And in life's most difficult times, we grow in wisdom the most. Now, this is a generality. This isn't a hard and fast rule. But we think about the happiest of times, and we think about the most difficult, tragic of times. And oftentimes, again, generally speaking, we will see that wisdom itself is to be gained in those difficult times. Kind of the for instance on this is that typically there is no other event that will draw people to consider the meaning of life and its brevity more than a funeral, right? You go to a funeral, and particularly people who maybe aren't believers, particularly people who, they've never really considered what is after death, what does happen when a person dies. And so you go to a funeral and you're faced, confronted face first with death and with the fact that everything that is alive will have its time. It is appointed unto man once to die. And so we see all of that, and you begin to contemplate and to think about, what does it really mean? What is life? What happens after death? Psalm 90 verse 2 refers to this, and it says, "So teach us to number our days, that we may apply our hearts unto wisdom." right? Consider us to number our days. Teach us to number our days. Think about life. Think about its brevity. James talks about the brevity of life. But he says that we may apply our hearts unto wisdom. And so Solomon is really just bringing out, he's not glorying in this. He's not reveling in this. But he's simply pointing out the wisdom to be found in such tragic and difficult times, as opposed to, more often the happier times. But he also understands that there's danger associated with difficulty. He's not just saying it's only good for people to suffer. No, there's dangers associated with this. And he says, surely oppression maketh a wise man mad. And so Solomon here underscores the importance of patience then, is what he's drawing to. Underscores the importance of patience for the good and in the bad. For those who are not patient become angry. And then he says, anger resteth in the bosom of fools. Right? And so there's a sense in which we suffer, whether that's through the death of a loved one or whatever the case may be. And there's kind of two ways that can take us. That can take us down the road of wisdom, where we learn from that, where we grow from that as a human, as a believer in our relationship with Christ. Or we can take the other road where it just drives us into madness and anger and depression. And Solomon sees both, and I would say probably experienced both. And he's trying to say, learn from those experiences. Don't let those experiences drive you into foolishness. Let those experiences drive you into wisdom and grow and become a better person as a result of them. And so he looks then at the benefit of wisdom, particularly wisdom that could be gained from these kinds of things. And he talks about, it's an interesting verse, talk about romanticizing the past. And he basically says romanticizing the past, it does nobody any good. Besides the fact that Solomon has already told us that there's nothing new. Really, we think about all the old times were always, they were better. They were better than now. And Solomon has already told us, no, nothing ever really changes. They weren't better than now. It was just basically things are the same. And so, don't romanticize the past. Not to say don't think about things that have happened in the past, but don't romanticize the past. So he says essentially we need to be thinking about things that are happening now, and because in the now is where wisdom, and he compares it to money, is most useful, right? Wisdom is most useful to us now if we're using it properly. And so we can think about how good things used to be, how we might want things to be in the future, but ultimately what we need to be concerned about is what are we doing in the now, in the time that God has given to us right now, today. Focused on that. Again, not that we can't consider those other things, but we need to be focused where God has planted us, and that's where we're going to do the most effective things. And then he closes this section. He closes this section with a look towards the mysteries. So I knew how to phrase this. The mysteries of God's ways. The mysteries of God's ways. And it leads him to this conclusion. In the day of prosperity be joyful, but in the day of adversity consider. God also hath set the one over against the other, to the end that men should find nothing after him. And so I liked what Wiersbe said about this. He said, God balances our lives by giving us enough blessings to keep us happy and enough burdens to keep us humble. Right? And so this whole kind of beginning of this chapter, not quite half, but the beginning part of this chapter is Solomon comparing and contrasting the good times in our lives, the bad times in our lives, and what are we supposed to do with them? How are we supposed to grow from them? Don't waste moments in your life, right? Don't allow something good or bad to just be a fleeting moment where there's no growth, there's no wisdom attained, there's no maturity. Allow everything that comes our way be something that is building us up. Don't waste moments, I think is a good way to refer to that. And then he kind of switches gears here, and then he begins to, again, kind of, as he's done so many times in the book, to kind of look at the world, and through the eyes of a secularist looking at the world, and he comes to really what is a common conclusion, which is many times people see this. We see righteous people suffering, and we see wicked people prospering. And this is something that, I think everybody could kind of come to this conclusion if we're honest with ourselves, and if we just take any time to get a look at the world. And so I think it's verse 14. In the day of prosperity, verse 15, sorry. All things have I seen in the days of my vanity. There is a just man that perisheth in his righteousness, and there is a wicked man that prolongeth his life in his wickedness. Right? All of us can probably think of some kind of example, whether or not it's happened to us personally or in the immediate context around us, or just something we've seen far off in politics or whatever, where you see the most wicked, seemingly the most wicked people rising through the ranks and becoming quote-unquote prosperous, or the most honest, humble, quote-unquote righteous people seem to kind of just get stuck and just, they're on the treadmill of life, you might say, and just they never seem to get anywhere. And so Solomon sees all this, and so he takes a very, and I want to kind of get ahead of myself a little bit, he comes to a very cynical mindset. Okay, so everything he's about to say, you have to understand coming from this perspective of cynicism. And so it leads him, and it might sound good at first, but understand where he's going. It leads him to take kind of a balanced view of life. Now, at first you might say, well, that sounds good. That's everybody should do that. And so he kind of comes to this conclusion that there should be everything in moderation until you understand that he actually means everything. And so, in other words, not just good things in moderation, everything in moderation. You can do a little bit of righteousness, but you can also do a little bit of wickedness. You can do a little bit of good here, you can do a little bit of bad there, and all that is fine, because ultimately the people who fear God are going to escape it all anyways. They're going to get to leave this earth, and the wickedness, the things that they did, doesn't really matter. And so this is verse 16. Be not righteous over much, neither make thyself over wise. Shouldest thou destroy thyself. Be not over much wicked. But you get that, a little wicked. Don't do a lot of wicked. Be not over much wicked, neither be thou foolish. Why shouldest thou die before thy time? And so again, this is he has a very cynical mindset about the world at this particular time. And so at the end of the day, here's what he says: there's not a just man upon the earth that doeth good and sinneth not. Right? Nobody's perfect, so why try? That's kind of the mindset that he's brought himself to. And so with that in mind, he talks about, and this in and of itself is good advice. But he talks about that when it comes to the things that people say about us, we really shouldn't care if people curse us, quote unquote, say negative things about us or say bad things about us. We shouldn't really care, because at the end of the day, we're also cursing other people. We also say bad things about them. Now, it is good to not take so much stock in the things that people say about you, that one negative word from somebody who doesn't really care about you just makes your life fall apart, right? We don't need to take that much stock in the things that people say about us. So it's good advice on its own, but it's coming from a very cynical heart. And when you understand that, you understand where he comes from in the next verse, because the cynicism leaves Solomon profoundly unsatisfied, right? And as it would for people who are, I will say this, for the honest secularist, and I think those are few and far between, but for the honest secularist, I think they will tell you that they become profoundly unsatisfied with life, because there is no moral standard. There is no objective standard for them. And so they look at things like the wicked prospering and the righteous suffering, and they have no answer for these things. And so this is Solomon, and he says this: all this have I proved by wisdom. I said, I will be wise, but it was far from me. That which is far off and exceeding deep, who can find it out? And so he's looking at all this, and he's saying, I don't know what to do with this. I can't figure this out. It makes no sense to me why the wicked would prosper and why the righteous would suffer. And so he goes through, and he talks about kind of this personal experiment where he goes through and he's testing people, I guess you could say. And so in all of his testing of the world, he said that he only found, out of 1,000 men and out of 1,000 women, he only found one man and not a single woman who was not a disappointment to him in some way. Now let me say something about this. As I was reading this, I'm trying to think, what is he saying about this? What's the truth to be learned here? And there's something I think we can determine that it is not. And so when he says, I only found one man in 1,000, and I didn't find a single woman in 1,000 who wasn't a disappointment to me in some way, we got to understand that he's not saying that inherently speaking, men are objectively better than women. That's not what he's saying. Because several reasons. First of all, the Bible refers to many women who were wise and I'll say quote-unquote righteous, and I say that way just because nobody's truly righteous, you understand, but what we might consider to be a righteous person. The Bible refers to women who would fit that mold. Furthermore, as I've said all along, I do believe Solomon to be the author of this book, and it makes a whole lot of sense if Solomon is the author of this book, why this would be the case. And so given Solomon's history, which he alludes to in verse 26, because verse 26, he says, I find more bitter than death the woman whose heart is snares and nets, and her hands as bands, who pleaseth God, or whoso pleaseth God shall escape from her, but the sinner shall be taken by her. That kind of could define Solomon's life. And so Solomon, as we know, was one of the wisest, probably the wisest person who has ever lived, and yet his heart became trapped by the snare of his lustful ideology towards women. By the height of his reign, he has 1,000 women, and so there you have that 1,000 number. He has in 1 Kings 11:3, he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines. So there was 1,000 women who he was, involved with. It says this, and his wives turned away his heart, right? And so verse 26, we can see why Solomon is saying that, and also it makes a whole lot of sense why, if he's surveying or interviewing or whatever the case may be, 1,000 women, if this is the assumption that these are 1,000 women he's looking at, it makes a perfect sense why he wasn't disappointed with that, because these were pagan women. He wasn't with godly women. And so, again, we can understand what he's not saying here. He's talking about personal experience here, and ultimately talking about just the generally speaking, the sinfulness of humanity, and it exists, and it is universal. And so, in his own personal life, the 1,000 men and the 1,000 women, all he can say is, I found one man, and he doesn't name who it is, but I found one man who I could say, this is a good, righteous man. And then that's it. That's all I could find. And that doesn't, again, like I said, that doesn't say anything about men versus women. It says a whole lot about, first of all, the people surrounding Solomon, and also it says a whole lot about the sinful nature of humanity. We all have it. And so this is where his cynicism has led him. But he comes to the right conclusion in verse 20. And it's kind of an odd one, but he says this in verse 29. He says, Lo, this only have I found. And so all of that has kind of led him here. This only have I found, that God hath made man upright, but they have sought out many inventions. And so God made man upright. Ultimately, God made man, you could say, good. But they have sought out many inventions. They have sought out other means. They have sought out other things to do outside of the purview of what God ultimately had for them to do. And so, again, you might think, well, why is that a positive conclusion? Well, let me quote Derek Kidner here. He says, after the gropings of this chapter, this verse brings the refreshing certainty that our many schemes, or our many inventions, that our many schemes, our clouding of moral issues, our refusal of the straight way, are our fault, not our fate. Again, they are our fault. They are not our fate. He said, futility was not the first word about our world, i.e., God hath made man upright. It no longer has to be the last. And so if God has made man good originally, there is a world in which man can be good. Now, again, Solomon doesn't understand all this because of the time in which he lived. But now, from a New Testament perspective, we can come back to this and understand, where is that world where man can be made good? Well, it's in eternity with Christ. And the only way to get to that eternity is through his blood, because it is only through his blood where there is found forgiveness of sins, and only then can the righteousness of Christ be imputed to our account, and then we get to go be with Christ in that world where man will be good again. And so whereas man made man upright, there's a world where God will make them upright again. And so this is, like I said, Solomon, he couldn't have understood all of that, but he could see glimpses of that. And this is just kind of the truth of how there were Old Testament saints to begin with. Because obviously, I believe the Bible is very clear on this, that salvation has always been by grace through faith. Romans talks about that even Abraham was saved by grace through faith. Right? Abraham had faith that God was going to do the things he was going to do. And so Old Testament saints were saved by grace through faith, looking forward to what God would do. New Testament saints are saved by grace through faith, looking back on what God has already done. And so Solomon had this looking forward perspective. And so he, the New Testament also talks about these things were a mystery to them. They didn't have all of this revealed yet. But what he could say is that as God had made a man good once, it only makes sense that God will make man good again. And how do we experience that? By faith in him. By faith in him. And so there's a lot left unsaid here, obviously. But we also have to understand the time period and the mental anguish with which Solomon was clearly experiencing as he was going through the experiences leading him to the writing of Ecclesiastes. Like I said at the very beginning, assuming this was late on in Solomon's life, he had experienced a lot of tragedy, a lot of beginning so well with his relationship with God and the wisdom that God granted him and the riches that God blessed him with. Everything starting so well to ending so poor, specifically because he failed to do that which God told him. Don't get entangled with people who are going to draw your heart away from me. And he didn't just get entangled. He got in a whole entangled web of people who drew his heart away from God. And so he failed, and he was reaping the consequences of those things. And Ecclesiastes then becomes both the result and the warning because of what he went through. And so, again, there's you kind of have to read between the lines a lot here with Ecclesiastes, but there's a lot of wisdom to be found because it's written by the most wise man who's ever lived, who experienced a lot of things in his life. Okay.